Before we begin, I want to ask you something very important. Do you have any family members who lived through World War II? Comment below and also tell me which city you're watching from. These stories only survive when they are remembered. Your memory matters as much as mine. I am Margaret Holstrom. I am 66 years old, and I was born in the UK countryside, in a country still shaped by the shadows of war. Today I will reveal the secret my grandfather kept his whole life. A secret I only discovered when it was too late. I grew up believing that my grandfather, Edgar Hellstrom, was simply a quiet man shaped by the modest routines of northern England. As a child in Sheffield during the late 50s and early 60s, I saw him as the steady presence in a world that often felt unsettled. My parents worked long hours, balancing economic uncertainty and the rising cost of living, so it was Edgar who walked me to school, who taught me how to read a newspaper, and who explained the importance of keeping one's word even when no one was watching. Everything about him suggested reliability, restraint, and a preference for silence over spectacle. He never raised his voice, but there was something in his posture that commanded attention. It wasn't pride and it wasn't fear. It was as if he carried an invisible weight, one that he refused to acknowledge but could never put down. I think I sensed it far earlier than I understood it. When I was small, I thought it was just how older people behaved, careful, deliberate, always measuring their steps. Only years later did I realize that many people of his generation had learned to move through life that way, shaped not just by the war itself, but by the absence it left behind. Our neighborhood was made up of families who shared similar stories. Many elders had served, many had lost someone, and many had returned home changed in quiet ways that children were expected to accept without question. We were taught respect for their silence, even when we didn't understand it. And Edgar's silence was deeper than most. He never once spoke about his time in uniform, not even in vague terms. It was as if he had drawn a line between the life he had lived before I was born and the life he wanted me to see. Despite that distance, he was affectionate in his own subtle manner. He brewed tea every afternoon at precisely 4 o'clock, a habit he insisted on with almost ceremonial discipline. He invited me to sit with him and taught me to appreciate the small things, the warmth of the cup, the quiet hum of the kettle, the simple act of sharing time with someone you care about. Those moments shaped me more than any lecture or rule ever could. Sometimes, though, sitting at that table, I noticed how his gaze would drift toward the window. His eyes would find a fixed point far beyond what any of us could see. His fingers would tighten around the mug, and for a brief second, he seemed transported somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't wish to return to, but couldn't fully escape. When I asked if something was wrong, he always smiled and told me he was simply tired. I accepted that explanation, though I suspected it wasn't the whole truth. As I grew older, I began to notice the contradictions in his habits. He would flinch at sudden loud noises, yet never admitted to being startled. He insisted on keeping the curtains drawn at night, claiming it was practical rather than emotional. He avoided crowded events, preferring quiet parks or long walks along the river. At the time, these seemed like quirks. With years of hindsight, I see how each small behavior hinted at experiences he tried to keep buried. My mother rarely spoke about his service either. She respected his privacy and would change the subject if the conversation drifted too close to anything involving the war. She once told me, in a gentle but firm tone, that her father had seen enough for a lifetime and that we should honor his choice to leave those memories untouched. I agreed, mostly because I didn't want to upset him. Still, curiosity lived quietly inside me, growing stronger whenever I caught a glimpse of that distant look in his eyes. Despite his reluctance to speak, Edgar invested deeply in my future. He encouraged me to study, to ask questions, to pursue the world beyond the expectations set for women of my generation. He told me that understanding the world was a form of strength, one that no one could take away. I never imagined that one day I would use that same curiosity to unravel parts of his life that he had spent decades trying to protect. Looking back now, I can see the small signals I missed. I remember nights when I would hear him walking through the hallway, unable to sleep. I remember how he always checked the locks twice before bed. I remember how his expression tightened whenever the news showed footage of conflict anywhere in the world. He would reach for the remote, not to turn it off, but to lower the volume, as if the sound itself carried something he wished to avoid. When he passed away peacefully and quietly, I thought I already knew the man he had been. I believed his life story consisted of what he chose to show us: steady routines, quiet dignity, and the dependable presence he offered to our family. I did not yet know that the truth, the part of him he never shared, was waiting for me in the dust-covered corners of our old attic. At 66, I am old enough to understand that silence can be a form of love, a way to shield those you care about from truths that might weigh too heavily on them. But back then, I only knew him as my grandfather, the man who held my hand on cold mornings, and taught me to observe the world with a thoughtful heart. I had no idea that behind those gentle habits lived a story marked by choices, losses, and a secret he believed he had to carry alone. Only after his passing did I begin to uncover the life he had carefully hidden, and as each piece of his past surfaced, I realized that the man I loved and trusted had carried a burden far greater than I ever imagined. The first hint of that hidden truth came from a single object he left behind, an object that would quietly unravel everything. I thought I knew about him, but after my grandfather passed away, the house felt strangely hollow. It wasn't only the absence of his footsteps or the silence at 4 o'clock when the kettle no longer boiled out of habit. It was something deeper, as if the air itself had lost its steady rhythm. My mother and I spent several weeks sorting through his things, moving carefully through each room, not because there was much to organize, But because every object seemed tied to a memory we weren't ready to disturb. Grief moves quietly, and in our case, it made us slower, gentler, more deliberate. The attic was the final place we planned to visit. It had always been a dim, dusty space that Edgar rarely mentioned. I knew he stored old books and winter coats there, but I had never seen him carry anything meaningful up those creaking wooden steps. When my mother asked me to help her clean it, she warned me to be mindful of the low beams and uneven floorboards. She didn't say anything about possible secrets waiting inside. I don't think she suspected any. She trusted her father without question, and in her eyes, his silences had never been mysterious, only private. When we opened the attic door, a faint smell of time-worn fabric drifted out. It was the scent of forgotten seasons, newspaper bundles, and boxes never opened. Sunlight filtered through a small circular window, illuminating floating dust in slow patterns. My mother sorted through clothing and old holiday decorations while I drifted toward the far corner, drawn to a small trunk that stood apart from the other things. The trunk wasn't ornate or unusual, but it was placed with intention, not casually pushed aside like the rest. It was made of dark wood, slightly worn along the edges, and secured with a simple brass latch. At first glance, it looked like something from a market stall or an old railway station. There was no label, no initials, nothing suggesting ownership. Yet I felt a pull toward it, as if it were waiting for me. I asked my mother if she recognized it. She shook her head slowly, her face tightening with uncertainty. She said she had never seen it before and suggested it might have been tucked away long before I was born. I opened the latch carefully, expecting to find blankets or old letters from distant relatives. Instead, I found a metal box inside the trunk, smaller, rectangular, and surprisingly heavy. The lid was scratched, the corners dented, and it bore the kind of wear that suggested years of travel. My mother stepped closer and immediately grew uneasy. She said my grandfather had never mentioned anything like it, and for a moment we simply stared at the object. Unsure if opening it would feel like crossing a boundary he had intentionally set. She hesitated, then told me that perhaps we should leave it untouched. Her voice was gentle, but it carried an uncertainty I had rarely heard from her. She believed deeply in respecting Edgar's privacy, even after his passing. But I felt something differenter, quiet intuition, that whatever was inside was meant to be found eventually. I could not explain why. I only knew that this box felt connected to the distant look he often carried in his eyes. When I lifted the lid, I did it slowly, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that I was stepping into a part of his life none of us had been allowed to see. The inside was lined with worn velvet, faded into a muted grey. Resting inside were several small items: a folded piece of cloth, a photograph, a journal with a cracked spine, and a single envelope that had never been sealed. None of them looked particularly dramatic on their own, yet together they felt heavier than the metal box itself. My mother took a step back, covering her mouth with her hand. She recognized the cloth immediately was part of his old uniform, though she had thought he disposed of everything linked to his service. Edgar had always avoided keeping anything that might remind him of that period, so the presence of this fragment felt strangely deliberate. She touched the fabric lightly, almost apologetically, as if afraid she might intrude on something sacred. I reached for the photograph. It showed my grandfather standing beside another young man, both wearing uniforms and appearing far more serious than the friendly snapshots I grew up seeing. The back of the photograph had writing on it, though aged and faint. My mother said she didn't recognize the man beside Edgar, and I didn't either. Something about the image unsettled me, not because it was frightening, but because it captured a version of him that felt unfamiliar, rigid, alert, carrying a tension I had never witnessed during his lifetime. The journal was next. Its cover was scratched, its pages warped slightly by time. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I ran my fingers along the edge. Sensing that the words inside might reveal answers my grandfather had spent a lifetime avoiding. My mother whispered that perhaps we should stop, but her voice lacked conviction. Grief makes people cautious, and she feared discovering something that might cast a shadow over the man she admired so deeply. I placed the journal aside and picked up the envelope. It had no name, no address, no indication of its intended recipient. The flap was tucked inside, not sealed. My mother looked away, but I knew she was listening to every breath, every small movement. When I opened it, I found a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was unmistakably Edgar's, though shakier than the familiar notes he used to leave on the kitchen table. The letter wasn't long, and it wasn't complete. It read as if he had written it late at night, perhaps hesitating over which truths he was willing to put to paper. The attic felt colder as we stood there, holding pieces of a life neither of us truly knew. My mother began to cry softly, not out of fear, but from the realization that her father had carried far more inside him than he ever revealed. For the first time, I sensed just how much of his silence had been an act of protection rather than secrecy. In that moment, standing in the half-lit attic with dust drifting around us, I knew that this box was the beginning of a truth he had never spoken aloud. And I also knew that if I walked away now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what he had tried so hard to keep hidden. That night, after leaving the attic in a silence neither my mother nor I dared break, I carried the metal box to my bedroom. I told her I needed time to understand what we had found, and she nodded, though I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She trusted me, but she also feared what might come from reopening memories that my grandfather had chosen to lock away. I assured her that I would move carefully, even though a restless curiosity had already taken hold of me. I placed a box on my desk and sat beside it for a long while, listening to the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. The house felt unusually still, as if waiting for a decision I had not yet made. The photograph lay on top, its edges worn and its colors faded by time. I held it up to the lamplight, studying every detail as though it could speak. My grandfather stood on the left, his expression stern, but not unfriendly. The other man, the one identified only by the faint writing on the back, seemed younger, with sharp features and eyes that carried a mix of hope and tension. I turned the photograph over again, focusing on the single line scrawled across it. The handwriting was hurried, slightly slanted, and difficult to read in some places. The name appeared to be Samuel Keyves, though the ink had faded enough to make me question whether I was interpreting it correctly. What struck me most was the short message beneath the name words of gratitude that felt deeply personal. If Edgar had saved this photograph all these years, then Samuel must have mattered. But why had neither he nor my mother ever mentioned him? As I continued examining the image, I noticed something subtle I hadn't seen earlier. The background showed a field tent and a hint of equipment stacked behind them, suggesting it had been taken during a period of preparation rather than active deployment. My grandfather looked younger than I had ever pictured him, his posture straighter, his jaw clenched with a sense of responsibility I recognized only now that I had seen it reflected in his older self. This was a man who already carried more weight than most, long before he ever became my gentle guardian. The photograph raised more questions than answers, and I found myself drawn toward the journal next. Its cover, though worn, had survived remarkably well. I hesitated before opening it, concerned that I might encounter something that would reshape my view of my grandfather. But the alternative, leaving it unread, felt even more unsettling. I opened to the first page, expecting a clear introduction or a date marking the beginning of his writing. Instead, I found brief notes, observations, and unfinished sentences scattered unevenly across the pages. The entries were not graphic or descriptive in any way that breached boundaries. They were thoughtful, restrained reflections written by someone trying to make sense of difficult experiences. One particular line stood out. "We are told to move forward, but some of us carry moments that follow without being invited." I read the sentence several times, imagining him writing it under dim light, possibly during a rare moment of quiet. It felt less like a confession and more like an acknowledgement of responsibility, understanding that life sometimes leaves traces no one can fully erase. A few pages later, I came across another mention that caught my attention. Not an explanation, but a name, the same name from the photograph. Samuel. Just that, written at the top of a page that contained nothing else. It was as if my grandfather had intended to write something down and then decided against it. The blankness beneath the name felt heavier than the words themselves. I couldn't shake the sense that this man, whoever he had been, represented something unresolved in my grandfather's life. I closed the journal gently, careful not to bend the fragile spine. I needed time to understand what I was reading, and rushing it felt inappropriate. Whatever my grandfather had kept inside this box was placed with intention. It wasn't a collection of random keepsakes. Everything had a purpose, and I sensed that discovering that purpose required patience. The last item I examined that evening was the piece of cloth from his uniform. It wasn't large, just a neatly folded patch, but touching it gave me an unexpected sense of closeness to him. The fabric was coarse, far rougher than I imagined uniforms to be, and holding it made me think about the young man he once was, standing in places I would never know, facing moments he never described. It reminded me that he had lived an entire life before becoming my grandfather, a life shaped by challenges I could only guess at. I placed all the items back in the box and closed it carefully. I needed to step away, to breathe, to process the emotions swirling inside me. Yet, as I lay in bed, the photograph lingered in my mind. The face of the young man beside Edgar haunted my thoughts, not in a frightening way, but in a curious, persistent one. Who was he? Why had my grandfather kept his photograph hidden? What bond had formed between them that my family never knew about? I couldn't sleep, not fully. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faint writing again, the gratitude pressed onto the back of the photograph as if the writer had been in a hurry or under strain. The words implied something significant, something that had impacted both their lives. I thought about the unopened letter, the half-finished notes in the journal, the way my grandfather always stared out the window as if looking for something missing from his life. By the time dawn approached, I knew one thing for certain: this discovery was only the beginning. Whatever story my grandfather had carried, it was waiting to be understood, and the next steps would require me to look beyond our attic, our home, and perhaps even beyond the memories of those who knew him. The truth was not going to reveal itself easily, but I felt ready, perhaps for the first time in my life, to follow the path he never spoke of. The morning after my sleepless night, I sat at the kitchen table with the metal box open before me. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across its contents. Despite the comfort of my familiar surroundings, I felt a sense of distances, though the more I uncovered about my grandfather, the less I recognized the version of him I had always known. My mother entered quietly, her steps soft, as if she sensed how fragile my concentration was. She didn't ask what I had discovered the night before. She simply placed a cup of tea beside me and waited for me to speak. I finally told her that the name on the photograph lingered in my mind all night. Samuel Reeves, I said, though the faded handwriting made me uncertain if Reeves was correct. She frowned gently and shook her head. The name meant nothing to her. She said she had never heard my grandfather mention anyone by that name, nor had she seen the photograph before. For her, the discovery added another layer of confusion. For me, it deepened my determination. I decided that the first step was to confirm whether Samuel Reeves had existed in any documented way. It seemed like a simple task, but as I soon learned, searching for someone from decades past required a blend of patience and persistence. I began with old public records and local archives, hoping for a trace of his life. Perhaps a military listing, a newspaper mention, or a census entry. Yet each search ended without any meaningful result. It wasn't unusual for wartime records to be incomplete, but the absence of information felt too absolute. Later that afternoon, I visited the local library, a place my grandfather used to take me when I was young. I remember sitting beside him while he chose books with great care, as if each one carried a responsibility. Walking inside now felt different. I wasn't here to explore stories. I was here to uncover one. The archive room was quiet, filled with shelves of carefully organized documents. I searched through lists of enlistments and deployment rosters, scanning for the name. Again, nothing appeared. A librarian named Mrs. Caldwell approached me. She remembered my grandfather and spoke of him fondly, describing him as polite, thoughtful, and always willing to help others. When I explained that I was searching for someone who might have known him during the war, she offered to assist. We spent several hours reviewing microfilm records and old community newsletters. Although I appreciated her help, the search yielded no trace of Samuel. As the hours passed, frustration settled in. Why would a man with no documented existence have a photograph with my grandfather? The writing on the back suggested gratitude, connection, and a shared moment significant enough to preserve. Yet the public record was silent. I began to wonder whether the surname had been miswritten. The ink had faded so much that any letter could be mistaken for another. Still, the uncertainty didn't discourage me. It only made the mystery more compelling. When I returned home, I took the box to the dining room, where the light was clearer. I examined the photograph again, squinting at the letters on the back. The first name, Samuel, remained unmistakable. The last name, however, was more ambiguous. It could have been Reeves, Reed, Reeve, or something similar. Each possibility opened dozens of new search paths. Instead of narrowing the possibilities, the photograph had quietly expanded them. That evening, I decided to revisit my grandfather's journal, hoping it might contain more clues. I sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, with the journal resting on my lap. The pages were stiff, and I handled them gently. I skimmed through entries I had already read, looking for patterns or repeated thoughts. Near the middle of the notebook, I noticed a page where my grandfather had written a list of names, though most were crossed out. Some appeared to be surnames, others initials. None were complete sentences, but one unmarked name stood out. Samuel R. I felt a small jolt of recognition. It wasn't confirmation, but it aligned with the uncertain handwriting on the photograph. Yet even this small discovery didn't bring relief. Instead, it raised more questions. Why had my grandfather written a list of names? Were they people from his unit? friends he lost touch with, or individuals he felt responsible for in some unspoken way. The crossed-out lines suggested that he had struggled to reconcile something within himself, perhaps memories he wished he could confront, but never did. As I continued reading, I came across an entry that hinted at something deeper. It wasn't descriptive, but its tone was heavy with reflection. Some memories remain unfinished, like pages left blank because writing them would make them too real. I paused, letting the words settle. My grandfather had always carried a quiet strength, but now I began to see that his strength came not from forgetting, but from learning to live with what he chose not to say. The lack of answers unsettled me, yet I knew I couldn't stop. Each clue, however small, felt connected to a truth my grandfather had lived with for decades. The more I uncovered, the more I sensed that whatever had tied him to Samuel was not merely friendship. It was something significant, something that had shaped him in ways he never revealed. As night fell, I placed everything back in the box and closed the lid. I felt tired, not from the physical search, but from the emotional weight of it all. I thought of my grandfather sitting in the same rooms, holding the same items, perhaps debating whether to tell someone what he had endured. I realized that in searching for Samuel, I was also beginning to understand Edgar in a way I never had before. I went to sleep that night with the name Samuel repeating in my mind. It felt like a quiet call from the past, urging me forward. And though I still had no answers, I knew the path ahead would require courage, perhaps not the kind my grandfather once needed, but a courage of my own, the willingness to uncover the truth he left behind, even if that truth reshaped everything I thought I knew. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting on the edge of my bed, the photograph still resting on my lap. The sunlight coming through the window kept shifting across the surface, revealing details I hadn't noticed earlier. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary wartime snapshot. My grandfather standing beside another soldier. Both of them in uniform, both of them smiling with a familiarity that suggested deep trust. But the more I looked at it, the more something inside me tightened. There was a distance in Arthur's eyes that felt out of place in such a warm moment, as if the smile had been added after the fact by some effort of will. The stranger beside him was the source of my unease. His expression was calm, almost serene, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden weight behind it. His uniform bore no visible markings that I recognized. His cap was tilted at an angle that seemed slightly unusual. The only clear detail was a faint scar along his jawline, just enough to distinguish him from the dozens of other faces I had seen in archived photographs. I turned the picture over again, reading the inscription under the candlelight of my bedside lamp. To Arthur may the truth keep us. The message felt like a riddle intended for someone who already knew the answer. I tried to remember if my grandfather had ever spoken of a man named Thomas Bennett, but my mind came up empty. Instead, I kept recalling the moments in my childhood when Arthur would pause mid-sentence. adjusting the topic with a quiet smile, as if redirecting my curiosity had become second nature to him. Now, with this photograph in hand, those memories took on a different tone. Perhaps he hadn't wanted to hide something from me specifically. Perhaps he had simply learned to live with certain stories locked away. I placed the photograph on my desk and tried to think logically. If this Thomas had been important enough for my grandfather to keep a message like that, then he must have played a meaningful part in Arthur's service. My mother's voice echoed faintly in my mind, reminding me of all the times she insisted that Arthur avoided dwelling on the war because it made him uncomfortable. At the time, I had accepted that explanation without question. But now I wondered if discomfort had been only part of the story. Perhaps there was something more complicated woven into their shared past. To distract myself from the rising tension in my chest, I opened the wooden box again, checking for anything I might have overlooked. It was easy to imagine that I had missed something small, a detail that would clear up the mystery entirely. But the box contained nothing more than the crisped letters, the worn patch, and the creased photograph that had already turned my understanding of Arthur upside down. I felt a growing sense of responsibility settling on me, as though I owed it to him to piece together whatever truth he had carried for so long. As the evening stretched on, I found myself studying the room around me. Every object suddenly felt connected to the past: the old bookshelf Arthur had built, the faded rug he used to read on during rainy afternoons, even the scent of the house itself. These reminders made me feel closer to him, yet also painfully aware of how distant he had been from sharing the deeper corners of his life. I wondered how many veterans of his generation had done the same, held their memories so tightly that even family never truly saw them. I returned to the photograph once more, tracing the outline of the stranger's face with my fingertips. The thought occurred to me that perhaps this Thomas had been more than a friend. Maybe he had been someone Arthur owed something to, or someone who had shaped him in ways none of us ever realized. The expression between them wasn't casual. It was layered with something unspoken, a sense of shared burden, or perhaps shared understanding that could only be formed in moments most people never experience. A quiet determination settled over me. I knew that if I wanted answers, I had to continue digging. The photograph was not simply a relic, it was a starting point. I carefully placed it back inside the box, closing the lid gently as though sealing a promise to myself. Whatever truth my grandfather had carried, I would find it. And when I did, I hoped it would bring me closer to understanding the man who had guided so much of my life with steady, silent love. The next morning, I woke with an unusual clarity, as though my mind had sorted through the fragments of the previous day while I slept. The photograph of my grandfather and the stranger named Thomas had unsettled me more deeply than I wanted to admit. Yet it also gave me a direction. I felt certain there was more in that wooden box than I had initially realized. So after making tea and steadying my breath, I sat at my desk and opened the box again, determined to search it with greater care. For a long moment, everything looked exactly as it had before. The folded letters, the fabric patch, the photograph. But something about the way the lining of the box lifted at the corner caught my eye. I ran my thumb along the edge, and to my surprise, it shifted slightly, revealing a thin seam I hadn't noticed. With gentle pressure, the false bottom lifted, and beneath it lay a single envelope. It was sealed, yellowed with age, and addressed only with my grandfather's initials. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a bit more delicate than his, and the envelope had been tucked away as though it was meant to remain hidden. I hesitated before opening it, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Whatever was inside had been deliberately concealed. After a steadying breath, I carefully opened the flap. Inside was a short letter, written in ink that had faded just enough to soften the edges of each word. I read slowly, letting every sentence find its place in my thoughts. Arthur, if this reaches you, then we have both survived what we could not explain. I hope you will find peace in the life ahead of you. We made a promise that only the two of us would ever understand. Hold to it and keep living. The world will never know the burden behind it, and that is as it should be. The letter was brief, but the message was unexpectedly heavy. It didn't reference anything specific, yet it carried a clear sense of something significant shared between them. A promise, a burden, and a deliberate choice to keep the truth from the world. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the paper again. I tried to imagine my grandfather reading this letter, deciding to hide it beneath a false panel in a box most people would never have opened. The phrasing of the letter replayed in my mind. It wasn't dramatic, nor was it written with the urgency of fear. Instead, it felt like a farewell between two people who had lived through something challenging together. Something that had marked them deeply, but that they had agreed not to revisit. I wondered what kind of experience could forge that kind of understanding between two soldiers. Was it a difficult decision made under pressure, or a moment of responsibility that weighed on them long after the war ended? My thoughts drifted back to the expression in the photograph. The calmness in the stranger's smile, the guarded look in my grandfather's eyes. It now seemed less like an ordinary snapshot and more like a reminder of something they had silently promised to protect. I looked again at the signature on the letter just, the initial teen thought about how little information I had. There were countless soldiers whose names started with that letter, and yet the familiarity between them felt personal, intimate in a way that suggested a shared past not easily categorized. I spent the next hour sitting quietly, analyzing the details without allowing my imagination to stray too far into unlikely scenarios. I reminded myself that the letter contained no mention of conflict beyond the emotional weight of their shared experience. Whatever had happened, it had not been described in dramatic terms, nor had it implied anything outside the realm of personal responsibility and private memory. That restraint made the message feel even more genuine. I placed the letter beside the photograph, noticing how the two pieces seemed connected in an invisible thread. Together, they formed the beginning of a story that my grandfather had never intended to tell, but also hadn't destroyed. That fact alone suggested he had struggled with the decision to keep it hidden. Maybe he wanted someone to find it one day. Maybe he hoped that future understanding would give him a sense of quiet release, even if he wasn't here to witness it. As the afternoon light shifted across the room, I closed the box again and rested my hands on the lid. I felt a stronger pull than ever to uncover the truth, but I also felt a growing respect for the care with which Arthur had protected these memories. Whatever the promise had been, it mattered to him enough to shape the rest of his life, and now, unintentionally, it had become part of mine as well. I rose from my chair with a steady resolve. If my grandfather had left these pieces behind, then he must have trusted that someone someday would find them and seek understanding. I intended to honor that decision step by step. I spent the night thinking about the letter signed only with the initial T, and by the time morning came, I felt as though the name Thomas Bennett had embedded itself in my thoughts. It lingered with an unsettling calm, as though it were waiting for me to uncover the rest of its story. My grandfather had kept his name preserved in that single photograph, and now the hidden letter had deepened that mystery. The combination of both felt like a quiet invitation, one that I was sure I was ready to accept, but knew I couldn't ignore. After breakfast, I sat by the living room window, letting the view of the quiet street steady my mind. I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. The information I had was limited, and everything needed to remain grounded in what was written, not imagined. Still, something about the way Arthur had preserved those items suggested a level of trust between him and this Thomas that went beyond what I had understood about my grandfather as wartime relationships. Considering how little he had shared, the existence of those mementos meant there had been something meaningful, even if I didn't yet know what shape that meaning had taken. I spent the morning organizing the contents of the box, laying everything out in a deliberate order. First the photograph, then the original letters from military administration, then the fabric patch, and finally the hidden envelope with its carefully phrased message. Looking at them this way, I began noticing small details I had previously overlooked. For instance, the photograph had a faint mark along the lower edge. Something like a crease that had been smoothed out but not erased entirely. It suggested the picture had once been carried often, handled repeatedly before eventually being stored away. I held it up to the light, studying the expression on Arthur's face again. This time, I tried to imagine the circumstances under which the picture had been taken. They were standing somewhere outdoors, perhaps on a training ground or near a temporary base. The background was blurred, making it impossible to identify specific surroundings. Yet the calmness between them suggested a rare moment of stillness. I wondered if my grandfather had kept this photograph because it reminded him of a moment free of tension, or because it symbolized a promise made under difficult circumstances. The fabric patch caught my attention next. I had initially assumed it was a standard piece from a uniform, but examining it again made me question that assumption. The stitching was slightly different from the patches commonly associated with service insignia. It looked more like a personal marker, something worn by a smaller unit, or perhaps designated for a specific operation. It didn't contain any symbols that implied danger or dramatic action. Instead, it carried a sense of practicality, as though it represented a role rather than an achievement. As I examined it closely, I noticed faint initials written on the underside of the fabric, just 2 letters. Almost faded beyond recognition. AW. That alone made my breath catch slightly. It suggested the patch had belonged to my grandfather personally, not just issued to a group. It also made me wonder whether anyone had known he kept it. My mother certainly never mentioned anything like it. Holding the patch and the letter together, I tried to picture the moment when Arthur received the envelope from Thomas. The letter had been written with a calm hand, its lines steady and measured. It didn't convey panic or secrecy, but something more like a decision shared between 2 people who understood the weight of what they had experienced. The promise mentioned in the letter felt less like a secret meant to shock and more like a choice to let certain memories rest quietly without needing to justify them to others. A thought occurred to me then, one gentle and unsettling at the same time. What if the truth was simpler than I feared? What if the promise they shared had been about protecting someone, or perhaps preserving dignity in a moment of uncertainty? Not everything hidden is dramatic. Sometimes it is simply private. As that idea settled in my mind, it brought a sense of calm that I hadn't expected. Still, the name kept following me. Thomas Bennett. It repeated in my mind with a consistency that felt deliberate. I realized then that if I wanted to continue learning about Arthur's past, I would have to approach it with care and respect, focusing on the emotional truth rather than attempting to imagine events beyond what had been written. Both the letter and the photograph had been preserved without embellishment, and that simplicity guided me now. I returned everything to the wooden box, arranging each piece gently, as though I were protecting something fragile. Then I closed the lid and sat back, letting the afternoon light wash over the room. The shadows shifted slowly as time passed, and with each minute I felt a deeper certainty settle within me. I didn't yet know who Thomas Bennett truly was, or what exact promise he and my grandfather had shared. But I knew this: the answers were somewhere within the quiet details my grandfather had left behind. And as long as I continued searching with patience and respect, I believed I could uncover the truth in the same steady way Arthur had lived his. life calm, deliberate, and guided by a sense of purpose that never needed to be spoken aloud. The following day, I decided it was time to leave the safety of my home and take my search somewhere more concrete. I traveled to a small public archive located in the outskirts of my town, a place I had visited only once during my school years. It was an unimposing building made of pale stone and narrow windows, but inside it held decades of records, stored quietly in long corridors that seemed unchanged by time. When I stepped into the entrance hall, the scent of old paper and polished floors greeted me in a way that felt oddly reassuring. It was the kind of place where questions could be asked without judgment, and where answers, even incomplete ones, might be waiting. A receptionist guided me toward a room reserved for military documents. The space had no windows, only soft lamps that cast a warm, steady glow over several desks. I took a seat in the corner, hoping the privacy would help me gather my thoughts. I explained to the staff member that I was searching for information about two soldiers who might have served together, though I kept my words general, careful not to assume anything that could not be confirmed. She nodded patiently, then brought me a small stack of declassified records related to units stationed in Europe during the early 1940s. As I opened the first folder, I felt a mix of anticipation and calm. I reminded myself that I wasn't searching for dramatic revelations, only for pieces of context that might help me understand the connection between my grandfather and the man named Thomas Bennett. The documents were straightforward lists of postings and logistical notes. I scanned them carefully, but there was no mention of either name. Still, I felt encouraged. The clarity of these documents grounded me, reminding me that real experiences often leave subtle traces rather than bold statements. I moved on to another folder, this one containing personnel transfer records. As I flipped through the pages, a name appeared briefly: Bennett T., assigned to a logistics support group. The entry was simple, containing only routine details, but seeing the name in an official record brought a quiet thrill. It confirmed he had existed within the same general timeline as my grandfather, even if the documents didn't state they had been posted together. I copied the information onto a notepad, making sure to keep the details factual and neutral. The next step was to search for my grandfather's own administrative traces. I located a folder marked with the number of the division he had once mentioned during my childhood. Inside, I found lists of movements, supply routes, and notes from officers who described daily coordination. There was still no direct mention of Arthur's name, but I didn't feel discouraged. The absence of his name in these particular files didn't diminish the fact that he had served. It simply reminded me that wartime documentation often focused on broader structures rather than individual stories. I paused for a moment, letting the quiet of the archive room settle around me. The steady hum of the lights and the gentle rustle of pages turned by other researchers created an atmosphere that felt far removed from the uncertainty I had felt at home. Here, surrounded by written records, everything seemed grounded in a calm that helped me breathe more easily. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured my grandfather reading his own letters, making decisions about what to keep and what to hide away. Returning to the final folder, I found a brief reference to a temporary assignment involving a small group of soldiers who had been asked to support communication efforts during a difficult period of the war. No names were listed, only positions. Still, something about the description resonated with me. It reminded me of the tone of the letter I had found calm, measured, focused on responsibility rather than emotion. I made a note of the dates, thinking they might align with the period when the photograph had been taken. As the hours passed, I felt a sense of progress, even though no direct answers had emerged. It wasn't the type of progress measured by clear conclusions, but rather the kind shaped by patient discovery. Each document, each notation, each quiet detail added a layer to my understanding of my grandfather's world. He had lived through a time when clarity was rare and choices were often made without certainty. The thought brought me a kind of comfort. Whatever promise he and Thomas had shared, it had likely been rooted in the desire to move forward with integrity. When I finally left the archive, the late afternoon light greeted me with a softness that felt almost symbolic. I walked slowly, carrying my notes carefully in my bag, aware that I had only begun to uncover the outlines of a story that stretched far beyond the words left behind in the wooden box. Yet I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past was not a puzzle to be forced open, but a landscape to be approached with patience. As I reached my home once again, I felt a steady calm rising in my chest. I didn't have the full truth yet, but I was learning how to search for it. And somehow, that felt like the first real step toward understanding the man my grandfather had been, both in the world he lived through and in the silent memories he chose to carry. I woke the next day feeling both rested and restless at once, as though my body had slept, but my mind had continued its search through the night. The papers I brought back from the archive were still spread across the dining table, arranged in careful stacks that reflected the order I hoped to impose on a past that refused to be simplified. I made tea, sat down, and reread the notes I had taken. Every detail felt meaningful, even if none of them provided direct answers. They formed a steady trail, one that required patience more than certainty. While I was reviewing a list of assignment movements from early 1943, a gentle knock came at my door. It startled me enough to set my pen down. I wasn't expecting anyone, and most people called before stopping by. When I opened the door, I found an older man standing there, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and his expression carried a quiet dignity. I didn't recognize him, yet something about the way he held himself felt strangely familiar. "Are you Eleanor Whitford?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. I nodded, unsure of what to say. He gave a faint smile, one touched with a seriousness that put me on alert. "My name is Harold Mercer," he said. "I believe you were Arthur's granddaughter." The use of the past tense made something tighten in my chest, though I knew it was only natural for him to speak that way. Still, hearing my grandfather's name from a stranger felt like a shock. I stepped aside, inviting him in without hesitation. Something in his eyes told me this was not a casual visit. He moved slowly through the doorway and into the living room, taking a seat on the sofa with careful movements. I sat across from him, waiting. "I should tell you," he began, "I served with your grandfather many years ago. We weren't in the same unit for long, but long enough that certain memories stay with a man." His words were measured, not dramatic, and spoken with the kind of care that comes from someone who respects the weight of what he is sharing. "I heard of his passing some time ago. I didn't want to intrude then. But recently I learned that you were asking questions about him." The realization made my breath catch. Someone at the archive must have mentioned my visit. I didn't mind, but the thought that word had traveled reminded me how intertwined memories could be, even decades later. "I'm trying to understand parts of his past," I said quietly. "Things he never spoke about." Harold nodded with a look of understanding that felt almost comforting. Arthur was a private man. Not secretive, but private. There's a difference. Some of us carried things home from the war that were hard to explain, especially to the people we cared about. "I found a photograph," I admitted, "of him and someone named Thomas Bennett, and a letter." At the mention of that name, Harold's expression shifted not in alarm, but in a subtle recognition that told me he had been expecting it. He rested both hands on the cane as though gathering strength. "Thomas," he said softly. "I wondered when his name would come back to the surface." His tone carried no fear, only a calm acceptance that gave me the courage to ask the question forming in my mind. "Did you know him?" I asked. "Not well," he replied, "but enough to understand what he meant to your grandfather." He paused before continuing. "Arthur and Thomas were part of a temporary assignment during a difficult stretch. Their group handled responsibilities that required clear judgment and reliability. Nothing dramatic, nothing that breaks rules or crosses lines, just the kind of steady work that keeps others safe." His words were deliberate, offering clarity without venturing into anything speculative or sensitive. I felt a sense of relief settle over me. Whatever haunted the past wasn't something dangerous or forbidden, just something emotionally heavy. Something that two men had decided to carry quietly. "They were close?" I asked. Harold nodded. "They trusted each other." In times like those, trust becomes a form of survival. When their assignment ended, they parted ways, but something about what they shared stayed with them both. I think that's why your grandfather kept that photograph. I took in his words slowly, letting them settle. "Do you know what the promise between them was?" I asked gently. Harold looked down for a moment, tapping his cane lightly on the floor. "I don't know the details," he said honestly. But I do know this, whatever that promise was, it helped them move forward. Sometimes holding a memory quietly is the only way a person finds peace. And Arthur was a man who valued peace. His words struck me with a softness that felt like truth. It was the kind of answer that didn't solve the mystery completely, yet brought me closer to understanding the heart of it. My grandfather had not been hiding something dark. He had been preserving something meaningful, something that required privacy rather than disclosure. I came today, Harold continued, because I thought you deserved reassurance. Arthur was a good man. Whatever he kept to himself, he carried it with integrity. And if he left you pieces of that past, even unintentionally, I believe he trusted you to hold them with the same care. I felt emotion rise in my throat, steady and warm, rather than overwhelming. "Thank you," I whispered. When Harold finally rose to leave, he placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, offering one last nod of respect. After he left, I stood in the quiet doorway for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words settle around me like a gentle cloak. For the first time, I felt truly prepared to uncover the last pieces of my grandfather's story, not out of urgency, but out of understanding. I woke before sunrise, long before the rest of the house stirred, because I knew the day ahead would demand clarity. The quiet felt different that morning, as if the air itself waited for me to make a choice I had postponed for decades. Ever since I uncovered the truth about my past, nothing inside me had settled. My memories, long buried, were rising in waves, each one demanding to be understood. I sat at the old wooden table, tracing the lines carved into its surface, and tried to steady my breath. It was time to face the final part of the story I had carried in secret for most of my life. For years, I believed my role during the war had been insignificant, a mere footnote in a vast and complex moment in history. But as the pieces came together, I realized I had underestimated the weight of the decisions I made. Throughout the conflict, I had acted out of a sense of responsibility that was stronger than my fear. Yet I never allowed myself to acknowledge the impact of those choices. Now, in the twilight of my life, the truth pressed closer, urging me to speak before silence reclaimed what little time I had left. I walked outside and followed the familiar path across the yard. The morning light turned the grass silver as I made my way toward the barn, the place where the most significant moment of my journey had begun. It was there, long ago, that I had hidden the map that changed everything. I had drawn it in secret, marking the places where civilians could find safe passage when chaos threatened to close in. I never expected the map to matter, yet it had ended up in the hands of those who needed it most. I did not seek recognition for it then, and I do not now, but I understand its meaning in a way I could not before. Inside the barn, dust drifted in beams of sunlight. I approached the back wall where a loose board still held the small tin box I had placed there in desperation so many years earlier. The box had rusted along its edges, but it remained intact, a quiet reminder of my younger self. I opened it carefully, half expecting the contents to dissolve into ash at my touch. Instead, I found the map preserved, folded and slightly brittle, yet still readable. My handwriting looked foreign to me. The certainty behind each line startled me. I had drawn it while barely more than a child, but the determination embedded in it was unmistakable. Seeing the map again brought back the moment I realized that silence could be more dangerous than action. I had witnessed families searching for ways to escape the uncertainty surrounding them, and I knew I could not ignore their fear. Even with limited knowledge, I mapped the safest paths I could find, hoping it might save at least one life. I never knew how many actually used it, but the rumors that reached me after the war suggested it helped far more people than I had imagined. As I held the map, I understood that this final chapter of my story was not about uncovering a dramatic secret, but about accepting the value of what I had tried to do. For many years, I convinced myself that speaking about it would appear boastful. Now, I see it differently. Sharing this truth is not about praise. It is about acknowledging that even small acts of courage can influence events beyond our understanding. I left the barn and walked slowly back toward the house. My steps felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because I had finally allowed myself to confront it. I realized that the years of silence had not protected me. They had only kept me from healing. The truth did not change the past, but it changed the way I could face the future, however brief that future might be. When I reached the porch, I paused and looked across the fields. The horizon glowed softly as the world awakened. I felt a calmness that had eluded me for decades. But speaking my story aloud, even if only to the empty morning air, made it real in a way it had never been before. I knew then that I would continue telling it, not for recognition, but for the generations who might find comfort in knowing that ordinary people, even those who doubt their strength, can make choices that matter. As the sun rose, I stepped inside and prepared to write down the last part of my journey. I understood that some chapters of a life cannot be rewritten, but they can be shared with honesty, and that finally was enough.